But we've got two more questions tonight to finish up for the spring. Here's the first one, question number 28 in this session. Why did God sometimes order the Israelites to murder everyone, including women and children? If you're familiar with the Old Testament, you may know that there's some pretty difficult sections in the early parts of the Old Testament history when the Israelites were moving into the Promised Land, and the commands that God gave them to wipe those nations out, to not leave anyone living out of those nations. You see some of those in the books of Moses. You see them carried out in Joshua. To a certain extent, the Israelites don't follow through completely on the commands that God gives. But there are some sections in the Old Testament that are difficult to read and understand. And I'll be real honest with you. I think from an apologetic standpoint, this is probably the single most difficult question that I face as far as defending, did God really do this? Would God really have done this? Would he really have given this command to the Israelites? I think is one of the most difficult questions for Christians to answer if we're defending the inerrancy and the inspiration of all of Scripture, Old Testament and New Testament together. So the Old Testament does have these commands in it, and the question then is, well, why is this in there, and why is it ethically good for God to be able to make these kinds of commands? So let's look at some of these. Actually, we'll take a look at the Old Testament so that you can see them for yourselves. First of all, just the general rules for warfare I thought would be good to look at, so that you can see that these commands of annihilating a nation are not the normal way that Israel was to go about warfare. That there were some special circumstances that God gave those commands of total destruction. But Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 10 through 18, contains some general rules for warfare. Somebody read Deuteronomy 20, verses 10 through 18 for us.
When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. If they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, lay siege to that city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all the men in it. As for women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourselves. And you may use the plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies. This is how you are to treat all the cities that are at a distance from you and do not belong to the nations nearby. However, in the cities of the nations that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave anything that breathes. Completely destroy them: Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God.
All right, thanks, Ron. And that's kind of a tough one to give you right after you had mouth surgery. All those Jebusites and Hivites and Amorites and all that. But you did good. You're recovering well from the surgery there. Now, I thought this was a good passage to start off on, because we see what are the general rules of warfare in the first section, the first paragraph, verses 10 through 15. Then in verses 16 through 18, we see that there are a specialized set of commandments for the nations that are nearby, or the nations that are in the Promised Land, where the Israelites are going to go in and conquer. God is giving those lands to the Israelites as opposed to the nations that were currently in there. So the normal rules for warfare are to offer peace to start off with. If they decline peace, then you go in and you conquer the city. Even these are pretty strongly worded rules for warfare, as far as killing all of the men, but then you leave the women and the children alive, and they are slaves and property of the nation. So one of the things that I think that we need to realize and just be real honest about is that the world and the context in which the Old Testament particularly the earlier times of Old Testament history, is written. This is a very violent world. The Geneva Convention was not handed down with the Ten Commandments. You know, throughout the vast majority of world history, war has been incredibly brutal and fought really without much respect for rules or what is the right way to wage war or anything like that. Now, I'm thankful that we have taken steps in modern culture, and for some time, there's more of a code of conduct has developed, and people have understood that, okay, non-combatants are not part of the battlefield and they shouldn't be harmed and these kind of things if possible. You know, so I think those are good developments. War is a terrible, horrible thing in any circumstance, even if all quote-unquote rules of warfare are being followed. War is a terrible thing. But one of the things that's tempting for us to do when we look back and read these passages is to look back through 21st century goggles with our smart bombs and almost, you know, we handcuff ourselves in so many ways in wars that we fight to avoid collateral damage, which we're glad for. We don't want to kill innocent people, women, children, things in buildings that explode because we, you know, hit the wrong building with the smart bomb. Those things are all good that we do them, but we can look back with this modern warfare set and look back at them and say, well, we demand or we expect that God would have given them all of these rules of warfare and all of this revelation back there at this time. That's simply not the world that they lived in. And you know, it's very enlightening to remember that God is a God who has worked throughout all different periods of human history. So he works in a culture like ours that's much tamer, less violent. Now, I understand there are still violent and terrible things that happen today. The 20th century is filled with violence and murders and holocausts and genocides and things like that. That's not to say that it's over with. But, you know, there's been some time that's passed since the major world powers are exercising warfare in those kinds of ways. At least decades from where we stand right now. There was a time in the world where that was the way everybody waged warfare. And, you know, even just to be honest, if a nation back in that time had handcuffed themselves that way, they would have been easily defeated and they would have been killed and overrun by any other nation. So we don't import or we don't export our ideas about how warfare ought to be and import them back into the Old Testament and say, well, why didn't you do it like that? So there's an element that we need to realize that. But I'm not saying that answers the question. It's just an element that I want you to be aware of. So we have the rules for warfare, but we still have these other circumstances where there is to be complete destruction. And you even see a word here that's footnoted in verse 17. This is a word that actually becomes very important in this discussion. In verse 17, the NIV says, completely destroy them. And after destroy, you have a footnote. And if you look down at your footnote, it says the Hebrew term refers to the irrevocable giving over of things or persons to the Lord, often by totally destroying them. This is an actual concept in the Old Testament in a number of different passages. We'll see it again. The Hebrew word, I don't remember exactly how to pronounce it, but it's the word for destroy. And it appears twice in a row. Hebrew doesn't have a very large vocabulary, so when they wanted to emphasize something or put it in superlative form, they would repeat it sometimes 3 times, sometimes twice. Here, if you were to give a literal translation, it would say, destroy them. Completely and utterly destroy them would be a way of kind of putting it in more understandable English, the way that we would talk. But the idea is of complete and utter destruction that we see in verse 17. And your footnote is right that this has a very religious connotation to it. It's the idea of almost sacrificing this nation or turning them over to God. This is it's an element of what would be considered holy war in the Old Testament. this idea of complete and total destruction. And some of the idea here is that when there's normal warfare and you can collect things and property and slaves, that there is a benefit to you when you conquer a people. But when you completely destroy a people, you don't receive any of that benefit. There's no incentive, in other words, for you to have done that. It's in some ways an offering to God in the way that the idea of total destruction is laid out here. Now let me give you another example. In Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 6, this is where we begin to see these commands about the Promised Land nations coming into view in Deuteronomy 7. Would somebody read verses 1 through 7 for us? Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 through 6. Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 6.
When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you, and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them, do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons. They will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods. And the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. This is what you are to do to them. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles, and burn their idols in the fire. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession.
All right, so we see again here this idea of you must destroy them, or you must destroy them totally. Same idea, same concept of holy war and turning something over to God. And you notice in verse 2, the way the progression happens, he says, and when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you, and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. So the idea is that God gives the Israelites this foreign nation, and then the Israelites give it back to God in this total destruction. All the nations that are named there. We begin to see some of the reasoning, and we saw it a little bit in Deuteronomy 20 as well, but here we begin to really see it come into focus, one of the reasons that God is doing this and why he gives this command. It's because he is afraid if the Israelites leave these nations alive in the promised land, that there will be an intermingling of the peoples, that they will marry one another, that the Israelites will not worship Yahweh alone, that they will worship the gods of these Canaanites, the detestable gods that we talked about some last week, I believe. We talked some about Asherah poles and what would have been depicted on those, the sexual immorality that was prevalent in these Canaanite religions. These are corrupt, evil religions. They practice child sacrifice. They practice all kinds of sexual perversion and immorality as forms of worship. I mean, these are intrinsically evil religions that we're talking about here. And God says, I don't want there to be any chance that the pure worship of Yahweh is polluted with the gods and the nations of these Canaanites and Hittites and Hivites, Jebusites, Girgashites, Perizzites. I know I've heard some jokes about this, but I don't remember any of them right now. So we begin to see that a little bit about why God is doing this. He's concerned about the purity of the nation of Israel, preserving them as the nation that he has chosen out of all the earth to represent himself to the world. They are his chosen people. They're to be a chosen, pure, holy people in the world. Now we know that doesn't happen. We know Israelite compromises, and they become a byword among the nations as they're defeated by the Assyrians and later by the Babylonians because of their idolatry, because of their unfaithfulness to God. And some of that derives from the fact that they don't follow God's commands in carrying out these orders to completely destroy these nations. So Deuteronomy 7 is where this concept of complete destruction really begins to come into focus. Now, and when I'm doing this, I'm mainly laying out the issue for you. I'm not trying necessarily to defend at this point what God is doing. I just want to lay it out there so you can see what these passages are referring to. Now we see another facet come in, and I think this one may be probably the most eye-opening of the different dimensions to this issue in Deuteronomy chapter 9. So turn over a page or two with me to Deuteronomy chapter 9. And somebody read verses 4 through 6.
After the Lord your God has driven them out before you, do not say to yourself, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. No, it is on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. It is not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you are going to take possession of their land, but on account of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God will drive them out before you to accomplish what he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Understand then, it is not because of your righteousness that the Lord your God is giving you this good land to possess, for you are a stiff-necked people.
Yeah. So here's another dimension that I think this one may be ignored a lot of times when this question is asked, is that God actually says that this is part of my judgment on these nations because their corruption and their evil ways have become so great that I am going to destroy them. I'm going to carry out judgment on them. So there's an element in this where Israel is merely being the instrument of God's judgment on these nations. It's not merely that, all these nations are here and they're just going along whistling a happy tune along their merry lives, and the mean old Israelites come in and take their land and are to destroy them completely. These are evil, sinful nations that God has decided he's going to carry out his judgment on. Now, if you look at another time in Old Testament history, the book of Haggai relates, well, how in the world are evil nations going to come in and conquer Israel? How is God going to use evil nations to conquer his own people? And that's what the book of Haggai is written to ask the question for. And the answer is basically that's what he's choosing to do. That's his sovereign plan, and he's going to use even an evil nation to carry out his judgment, in that case, against the nation of Israel. So the idea that God could do the reverse and use the nation of Israel, his chosen people, to carry out his judgment on these other nations may be a little bit of an eye-opening aspect to this, and I think at least in some ways levels the playing field, because sometimes we look at these nations as just innocent, minding their own business, and the Israelites just come in and take over. But a passage like Deuteronomy 9, I'm going to give you a couple more examples here in a minute, is going to show very clearly that that's not what's going on with these nations. Let's look at, real quick, somebody turn to Leviticus 18, and then somebody else turn to Genesis 15. And we'll get you to read those.
Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things. For all these nations I am driving out before you have become unclean. And the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity. And the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you shall keep my statutes and my rules, and do none of these abominations, either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. For the people of the land who were before you did all of these abominations, so that the land became unclean. Lest the land vomit you out when you make it unclean, as it vomited out the nation that was before you.
Yeah, and if you notice, Leviticus 18 is kind of a famous chapter because it talks about various forms of sexual immorality. And it's particularly in that context that God brings up the fact that these nations that you're going into their land, I'm going to vomit them out of the land because of their immorality and perversion. And he says, don't you become a part of that, which unfortunately Israel did eventually.
Book of Judges.
And he says, I'll vomit you out of the land, and which did happen as well. So God gave warning there, but we see explicitly why that was going to happen. Now we also have this predicted very early on in the Bible, in Genesis 15. Would somebody read Genesis 15:16?
They shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete.
The iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So this is a very early form in prophecy that the iniquity of the Amorites and these nations in the Canaanite region it was going to continue to build, and it was going to reach its pinnacle at some point, and God was going to carry out judgment at that point. So we have this theme in the early books of the Old Testament that the nations of the Canaanite region were going to fill up in an iniquity to a certain point where God was going to judge them. You actually see that happening. Talked about in Leviticus 18, talked about in Deuteronomy chapter 9, for example. So when you put all of these things together, what you have is God has promised the land to the nation of Israel. He has prophesied that the nations that were there were going to live in great amount of immorality and evil, and that's exactly what happened. So God is carrying out judgment on the nations. He's using Israel as his tool to carry out that judgment. And as Israel does it, as they win those battles, they are supposed to do them in a way of total, complete destruction and annihilation, as a way of giving over all of the benefit that may have been received by them to God himself, and not taking it for themselves. So this is a picture of what holy war looks like in the Old Testament. I think I've summarized here. It's the fulfillment of promise that they would get the land, and it's intended to guard Israel from idolatry. That's another important facet. So God had a practical purpose in mind as well in the complete elimination of those nations. So there's a dual nature of what God is doing here. He's giving the land to the Israelites. He's taking it from those other nations in judgment. Now, having said all of that, it's still not an easy question to answer. You know, why did God allow this, or why did God command this? I mean, it definitely, to our eyes and our minds, seems harsh and brutal and almost unthinkable that God would do that. And here's where I would want to push back on that a little bit. Number one, against kind of a man-centered theology, in the fact that all of us, all people who have ever lived, not just the Canaanites because of their great evil, but all people who have ever lived are sinners and are deserving of God's judgment. And that's what we believe. And we believe without the sacrifice of Jesus, without our sins being covered by the blood of Jesus, all of us will receive God's judgment in hell. And that judgment is much, much worse than what God is commanding the Israelites to do to these nations. Hell is worse than being killed by the Israelites and more. We realize that, right? Sometimes we allow that reality to be greatly diminished in our minds. But it's spiritual. We don't see it. The really bad thing is to kill people. And hell is like, some kind of religious idea. But here's what we really believe, and what the Bible teaches, is that all people who don't know Christ receive the judgment of God for all eternity. And that's what it means to sin. That's the penalty for sin. That's the just and right penalty for sin. And it's out of his grace that God chooses to save us. Not because of anything we've done, not because of our goodness or our righteousness, just like God said to the Israelites, right? It's not because you are bigger or stronger, or not because of your righteousness that I chose you to do it. It's for my own purpose and grace. It's his own glory that God chose the Israelites. Same reason that he saves us. For his own glory, not because of anything that we've done. So we need to keep that in mind, that God's judgment, if he had decided not to save any of us, we would all rightly receive the same judgment that the Canaanites received in literal physical death and warfare. We would receive a right and just punishment in hell for all eternity. So when we start off with that as our default, the harsh, incredible judgment of a holy God on us because of our sin, then the question doesn't, then we're not able to throw the question back in God's lap, oh God, why would you kill all those people? That's what's the right and just thing to do. The real question is, God, why would you save anyone in the first place? Why would you choose the nation of Israel to save them? Why not allow them to be judged and killed in the same way as all these other nations? We know it's not because of their own righteousness as many ways as they fell and stumbled and were unfaithful, right? So part of the answer to this question is one that's not going to be received well by someone who is a skeptic and who is a scoffer or a mocker in a biblical worldview and what the Bible teaches, as far as God's sovereign rights over his creation and as far as God's right to judge sin. And that's just something that we have to live with as Christians, that there are going to be people who criticize, and there are going to be people who ask us this question, well, why did God do that? And it's going to be a tough question for us to answer for somebody that isn't coming with these presuppositions, that God is righteous and holy, and he is able to judge sin, and he's righteous and good in doing so. If they don't share those presuppositions, it's going to be very hard for them to understand. But when we come to it from a biblical standpoint, we can at least understand and agree in our minds that those things are true. Even if at an emotional level we still have a hard time understanding, man, it still seems really harsh, and it seems like a pretty extreme punishment. And in all of that, we just have to trust that God is still good, and that he's righteous, and that he's even loving in all that he does. That's what his word says, and that's what he's proved over and over again. And even in these commands that he's given to the nation of Israel, he's not compromising any of those perfections and his attributes. He's perfectly guarding his holiness and his love and his righteousness and his mercy and grace in all of those. So sometimes those answers can take faith, and that's where faith comes in, that God really is doing all those things in the midst of what is for us a pretty difficult thing to understand. All right, let me see if there's questions.